First, I'll activate my Pot of Greed card. This allows me to draw 2 more cards.
Wait a sec. Yeah, I think I got the wrong game, sorry. That card does seem pretty good though. Welcome back to the Cat's Tail. It's been a year since I made my original video on deck building, and it would be an understatement to say that a lot has changed. The number of cards in the game has more than doubled, and a lot of statements in that video are now at best outdated and at worst just wrong. So it's time to set things straight. In this video I'll mostly be looking at data from the Prince Cup. After all, these are the top decks built by the best players from both the Atlantic and Pacific regions. And if you haven't watched the Prince Cup knockout rounds yet, then go watch them. Amazing casters, amazing players, amazing games, just a fantastic time. I'll put a link down in the description. Anyway, it's no surprise that decks today are more powerful than when the TCG first released. There are simply more cards, and players will always choose to play the set of cards which combine together into the strongest deck possible. Because cards are stronger, players tend to spend more dice playing cards than they used to, compared to using skills. In particular, there are a lot of cards which, when played early, give a huge amount of value in the long run, often by drawing more cards or generating more dice in future turns. Investing resources in this way is known as ramping, and allows a deck to sacrifice actions on round 1 to have much more control over the game from round 2 onwards. In fact, the meta in this exact patch 4.8 has been described as the Ramp 8 meta, describing how the ideal opening for many decks involves using all 8 of their initial dice on round 1 to ramp, without using any skills at all. Looking at how games played out in the Prince Cup this year shows that the most common openings on round 1 dealt no damage to the opponent's characters at all. Even though there exist plenty of ways to put on pressure on round 1, and even take out an opposing character entirely, the extra resources provided by the powerful ramp cards and synergies can easily allow a ramping player to come back in rounds 2 and 3. Okay, so we know a bit about how deck building has changed. I'm going to show you in this video how you too can build a top tier deck, and a good place to start is with your characters. Back in 3.7 I said that the vast majority, over 80% of decks, had 2 characters of a matching element, so they could run powerful resonance cards. And sure, resonance cards are still good, and if you can play them, then you will very likely want to play them. But there are plenty enough other powerful cards now that you can play too. Woven dice are a good baseline you can compare other cards to. They are a card which straight up give you an elemental die for a card, and this is still considered a good card, but it's not exceptional anymore. Some resonance decks don't even play 2 woven dice cards, and many cards these days exist which can net you more than 1 die of value, even outside of resonance decks. So, over time, resonance decks have given away some ground to decks playing 3 characters of different elements, to the point where these rainbow decks make up the majority, about 2/3 of all decks. Picking characters for your team will therefore come down to what strategy you are building towards and what reactions you want to enable. For example, running 1 Cryo, 1 Hydro and 1 Anemo character allows for a potent combination of damaging and controlling reactions with Swirl and Freeze. Freeze is probably the strongest reaction currently, and it saw a lot of representation at the Prince Cup, since it gives you a very powerful tool with which to interact with your opponent's game plan. You might also at this point want to ask questions like whether you want your characters to be able to hold weapons and maybe even share weapon types, or to share factions allowing for the faction specific resonance cards. Another popular choice is to include a character with a revive like Cryo Hypostasis, which can give your team as a whole a bit more survivability. You want to have an idea of your game plan too. Some characters like Barbara or Layla can heal and shield, which can slow down the game and enable a stall strategy. Characters with high damage skills like Thunder Manifestation encourage a more aggressive style, whereas characters with powerful bursts, which enable other characters like Bennett or HoyoMix, can lead to powerful combo decks. At this point, you'll probably have some idea of if you want to play the talent cards in your deck with these characters. As a general rule, because many talents are very situational, you don't want to include talent cards unless you have a very specific plan on how you're going to use them. For example, if you want to build your whole deck around Bennett Burst, you'll probably want his talent card which buffs his burst. Or if you're planning on dealing most of your damage using Cyno's skill, then you'll want his talent card which buffs his skill. But try to avoid filling your deck with talent cards if you can't guarantee getting value from them. Of course, some characters are just stronger than others, and these are often safe choices to add to your deck. However, this tends to change patch by patch as characters get buffed and nerfed, which is why I don't think it's useful to go into the specifics. That being said, there are pretty much no characters who are absolutely terrible, so as long as you have a general strategy and can trigger some useful reactions, it's time to start thinking about what cards we want to add to our deck. Having talked about how powerful cards can be these days, we're going to want to make sure we can draw as many of them as possible. It's not entirely surprising then that the two top cards in the entire meta right now are pretty much purely for drawing more cards. Strategize has become as much of a staple as any card can hope to be, at a whopping 98% usage rate. It's an incredibly flexible card, whether you're playing it on round 1 to find yourself more ramp cards, in the middle of a game to make efficient use of spare dice of any element, or in the closing rounds to dig for a game-winning card. It improves the consistency of any deck, and the two cards you draw will often allow you to generate back the single die you spent. The fact it draws immediately sets it ahead from cards like the more niche treasure-seeking Sealy, as it never feels like a wasted card in your hand. Countdown to the Show 3 is in an odd way like Strategize's big brother. If it's worth spending 1 die to end up with 1 extra card in your hand, then it's worth spending 3 dice to end up with 3 extra cards. Most decks that play Countdown plan to play it without the discard synergy at all, because they know that those cards will pay back the initial investment in the long term. But for the decks which can make it cheaper with the discard effect, that's just a bonus. Combine this with its effect of fixing all the leftover dice perfectly, and Countdown justifies its inclusion in any deck that is hoping to ramp heavily. Other card draw options deserve an honourable mention. Leeway Harbour Wharf provides an efficient rate of +3 cards for 2 dice, as another ramp option especially for slower decks. And Treasure Seeking Sealy is also a great rate of +2 cards for 1 die, for decks which ramp less and use a larger number of skills in early turns. The relative dip in popularity of these cards reflects how important it is to draw into ramp cards quickly in the early game, and to draw into situational event cards immediately in the late game, making the delayed draw less valuable. Let's move now to look at some of the best cards we can use to ramp with, and some other support cards to go along with what we've got so far. Liben combines the best worlds of classic ramp and card draw, and has remained one of the most popular cards in the TCG all the way since the very first patch. Exchanging 3 dice for 2 Omni dice and 2 cards is already a great rate, and Liven does this while ramping those dice to the next turn. This provides great flexibility, for example allowing you to end turn early while still having dice to gain turn priority. Liven helps provide a use for dice of useless elements, greatly reducing the need for tuning, and can even take dice over multiple turns if necessary. Decks which really like carrying over dice in this way may also opt to run 1 copy of Panorama, which doesn't provide the card draw of Liben, but does allow for equally great flexibility of when you spend your dice. Timaeus is another powerful ramp option which at first looks niche. To get proper value from it, you need 6 artifacts in your deck. However, there are so many powerful artifacts in the TCG now, this is not a hard requirement to meet. And the reward is worth it. You'll immediately draw one of those artifacts, so you aren't even going down to a card to play it, and you immediately get 2 dice discount towards an artifact you play, which increases by 1 every round. It's a very high floor, which has an even higher ceiling of power level, especially with all the other artifact synergy cards which exist. Wagner has a similar effect for weapons, although since weapons tend to be more restrictive and expensive, it's not quite as widespread in its usage. However, it's still a powerful ramp option with a lot of uses in different decks. Dunyazad is a low cost option which helps tie the synergy together. Since Dunyazad also provides an immediate discount and draws another companion card straight away, it easily pays for itself immediately if you have enough companions in your deck, and it gives free value every turn after that. As well as Liben, Timaeus and Wagner, other strong companions which can be played alongside Dunyazad include Chef Mao for decks with multiple food cards, and Paimon for heavy ramp decks. Seed Dispensary has a similar role, providing a discount to your ramp cards like Timaeus and Wagner, and additionally supporting the addition of even more ramp options, such as Parametric Transformer and Dawn Winery. A zero cost card providing 2 dice worth of discount really helps with deploying these ramp cards cheaply and quickly, especially with the abundance of draw cards like Countdown to enable these synergies, as they allow you to effectively turn all that card advantage back into dice advantage. Golden House provides equal value to Seed Dispensary, but ramps you by discounting weapons and artifacts directly. Overall, these ramp cards embody a theme of providing exceptional value of dice refund for the cards and dice spent, as long as you can consistently enable their synergies, which isn't hard to do with all the card draw available. Unless you're playing a deck that desperately needs to take actions on round 1, such as certain hyper-aggressive decks or decks relying around charging a specific character's burst, then it's a good idea to choose a package of ramp cards which synergize well together. There are a few other popular support cards which have useful effects other than ramping, while being a bit more situational. The White Glove and the Fisherman is used mostly by aggro and combo decks that deal a large amount of damage in every hit, to make sure they can hit damage breakpoints perfectly and eliminate a character in 1 or 2 hits, instead of always being 1 or 2 points off lethal damage. Serene is used to generate random cards which are often useful for tuning, and Central Laboratory Ruins rewards you for tuning cards. However, these two are currently almost exclusively used in decks alongside All Devouring Narwhal, so they're a bit more niche. Storm Terror's Lair is good ramp for decks which are highly dependent on talent cards and high cost skills. Opera Epiclese is good ramp for decks with a lot of equipment cards. And Catherine is a good way to get more quick swaps for decks that heavily depend on it, and is usually played as a single copy. We've seen already that there are certain groups of cards with strong synergy between them, which are often known as packages. The Artifact Synergy package is probably the strongest of these, and certainly the most popular, because of the wide range of powerful artifacts which exist, and the fact that any character can equip them. The number 1 artifact is a staple of aggressive decks since release, Gambler's Earrings. You have to eliminate your opponent's characters to win, so an artifact which nets you 2 Omni dice when you do, for the low cost of a single die investment, is still great value, especially if your deck has a single character who is likely to eliminate more than one of your opponent's characters. Any aggressive deck will happily play at least 1 copy of this card. Close behind, however, is the ultra-flexible card, Heart of Cavarena's Brilliance. The fact this artifact costs 0 makes it incredibly easy to play, and you'll get another card to replace it as soon as that character takes damage on field. If you draw 2 or 3 cards with it over a few more rounds, then it's provided insane value for no cost at all. By drawing cards and existing as an artifact, Heart of Cavarena does a great job of kickstarting all of your other synergies, and is never a bad inclusion if you need a couple of solid artifacts to fill out your deck. Golden Troop's Reward is similar to Heart of Cavarena's Brilliance in the sense it's a very powerful artifact which costs 0, and is a solid option for any deck. However, while Heart of Cavarena gains value when the equipped character is on field, Golden Troop's Reward gains value on characters who stay off field, complementing Cavarena nicely. If you play it on round 1, it will give you a 2 die discount by round 3, enabling some very explosive turns. Golden Troop is the big brother of Golden Troop's reward. It's less flexible, but it does give you an even more impressive discount, and of course can be discounted by Timaeus. If you're playing a deck that wants to store lots of dice for a later turn, such as a deck revolving around Bennett's Burst, then these artifacts are some of the most powerful cards you can play. If you're playing a rainbow deck without Resonance, Gilded Dreams is a great payoff for artifact synergies. Although the 3 dice cost is expensive, it's easy to reduce that using cards like Timaeus and Golden House, to the point where Gilded Dreams generates more dice than you put in, while helping fix your dice to useful elements and drawing cards when you trigger reactions. Combining this with Lyre Song and Ball Princess can allow you to generate dice repeatedly. This is the strategy known as Magic, and although this is certainly much less powerful than it was at its height, before the cards Lyre Song, Gilded Dreams and Yayoi all got nerfed, it's still a strong package of cards for any non-resonance deck. If you're planning on playing a deck with some ability to heal your characters, Veteran's Visage is another really powerful option. It costs 2 dice, but it can give you a die and a card every turn, assuming you can trigger its effects when the equipped character takes damage or is healed. Combine it with characters who can heal like Kuki Shinobu or All-Devouring Narwhal, or with healing cards like Sweet Madame, and you have an artifact which provides huge value every turn for a very low cost. Marechaussee Hunter has a more powerful effect for a greater cost, but is also harder to enable. It's only played currently with the ability of All-Devouring Narwhal to heal itself, so I wouldn't recommend using this unless you have a way to enable it consistently. Ocean-Hued Clam is yet another artifact which is only really being played so much thanks to the Narwhal, although the fact it's an artifact which provides healing makes it decent. Tenacity of the Millelith continues to be one of the strongest artifacts available for control decks, providing a decent shield plus dice advantage every turn. Unfortunately, what this means is control decks haven't really got many new tools over the last year compared to all the other options other decks have gained to help them play a long game. The lower play rate of Tenacity of the Millelith and its smaller cousin General's Ancient Hell represents how control decks are less represented in the meta right now, but they remain a strong option for any control deck. At the Prince Cup, they mostly appeared in decks with Emperor Fire and Iron, which enables synergy with cards providing shields. Weapons are much more niche than artifacts, in the sense that it's usually only worth equipping them on a character who will deal damage many times during the match. Wagner helps to enable weapon synergies, but it's not usually a good plan to play weapons on multiple characters. You want to have in mind when you're building a deck which characters you want to equip. As a result, the usage rate of weapons is tied quite closely to which characters are being played. For example, Sayu is a great character to equip with weapons because her elemental skill hits twice, and each hit will get the bonus weapon damage. The most common weapon to use is Wolf's Gravestone, because getting up to +3 damage on each hit turns Sayu's 3 damage skill into a 9 damage skill. Because of this damage potential, Wolf's Gravestone is probably the strongest claymore overall. Other characters with multi-hit attacks like Kazuha and Neuvillette also hold weapons well for the same reason, so having a good idea of which characters are worth equipping weapons to is an important part of deck building. The strongest weapons tend to be the ones which have strong synergy with the character you equip them on, for example Wolf's Gravestone on Sayu to maximise damage, or Chile Tula's Remembrance on Neuvillette to discount normal attacks, or Prospector's Drill on Cyno with Chevreuse to provide protection and discard. There are lots of different weapons and it's not always obvious which ones are strongest, so feel free to experiment. However, there are also more generic weapons which can be decent on any character who deals the majority of your team's damage. The Aranara or Wooden series of weapons provide an immediate impact on play and have easier dice costs, making them a lighter investment to play since you get some value immediately. They work well with weapon synergy cards such as Where is the Unseen Razor as well. Another good set of weapons are the Sacrificial series. These tend to be at their best in slower decks since they give dice advantage each turn, but they can be used in any deck if you need to enable Wagner's requirement that you play 3 different weapons. So far we've talked mostly about cards that can give you permanent or repeated value over time, support cards, artifacts and weapons. But the bread and butter of a deck is the event cards, cards which have an immediate effect to give you a key advantage at a crucial moment. Leave It to Me is a great example of this, and earns its place as the number 2 most played event card after Strategize. We've seen a lot of ways already of using cards to generate dice advantage, but there are far fewer cards which can be used to generate additional actions. Leave It to Me is the best of these. It costs no dice, it can be played at any time to turn your next swap into a fast action. Having this in your hand gives you so many more options at any point in time. Furthermore, your opponent will always have to play around the possibility of you having it. Most decks, especially aggressive decks and those built around reactions, love to run 2 copies of this card. The Ball Princess and Lyre Song do slightly different things, but are both used in combination with artifacts to generate dice advantage. Ball Princess allows you to play cheap artifacts like Gambler's Earrings over your existing artifacts to generate dice, and also produces dice when characters with equipment die, whereas Lyre Song combines well with Gilded Dreams, Timaeus and Golden House to generate dice. In both cases, you're getting 2 dice off of 1 card, which makes these cards excellent value in decks that can support them. Tada is an interesting card which falls into the category of what you might call tech cards. Tada's main use is to unfreeze your active character by triggering the Shatter reaction, which makes it a valuable include if your deck is highly dependent on a specific character who you can't afford to get frozen. Tada also enables some other neat synergies, for example with Prospector's Drill. Other tech cards include Send Off and Mausoleum of King Deshret. These are cards which have seen a good amount of play in the past, but not really right now. And whether you want to include these in your deck really depends on what the meta is like and what sort of opponents you're facing. The Legend of Vanessa is a simple way to provide dice advantage, with a drawback that it only produces random dice. Usually you'd play this only if you're happy to tune a lot of cards, or if you have ways to easily use random dice, for example with lots of normal attacks. Sunyata Flower is a very high value card in a deck with a lot of cheap support cards. By sacrificing one of these cards, potentially after it has already provided some value, you can get 2 more random support cards and even get a dice discount on your next one. The cards you get might not be useful, but at least provide resources for tuning, which again can be interesting for some decks. Changing Shifts is a classic card which has always been a simple option to turn cards into dice advantage. You can think of making a swap free as being equivalent to saving 1 die. Many decks will have better options than this, which is why it's less popular than it once was, but for decks that really value that dice efficiency, this is a solid card. I Haven't Lost Yet has seen one of the biggest drops over the last year, dropping from 90% inclusion rate to under 10%, for a few different reasons. The card experienced a small nerf to being once per round only. There are many other sources of dice advantage now which are less situational. It's easier for opponents to eliminate your characters after you're forced to end turn, which makes this card worthless, and decks used to rely more on elemental bursts to end games than they do now. However, if your deck runs characters with high impact bursts you often find yourself 1 point of energy off using, I Haven't Lost Yet is still a very powerful card. For example, Kuki Nahida Linny decks love running 1 copy of this card to enable the possibility of Kuki's burst, after only having used her skill once. The other card to have massively dropped off is a really interesting one, the Bestest Travel Companion, which has gone from being one of the most played cards in the TCG to not being played at all basically. Why? Again, there are a few answers. Ramp cards can be played with dice of any type, and many of them refund you with Omni dice or aligned dice on later turns. Artifacts like Gilded Dreams and Golden Troop also help you with fixing in a similar way. And then, later in the game, when playing an artifact like Golden Troop or a ramp card like Liban might be pointless, you're very happy to tune these cards to act as your fixing. Especially with the quantity of card draw available, you'll usually have something to tune you don't need. Finally, Countdown to the Show fixes all your dice, while also providing serious card advantage, compared to a card like Bestest Traveler Companion, which represents a card of disadvantage. It's not being used for anything other than fixing. You can still run Bestest if you have almost no ramp or other way to get fixing, and are highly dependent on character skills, and it will still feel like a good card in those decks. But usually it's stronger to build your deck in a way where you don't need to play Bestest or other dice fixers at all. The last few cards here are less generically strong, but are still good at what they do. Calx's Arts is a cheap way to enable expensive bursts early in the game. Rhythm of the Great Dream is an easy source of dice advantage for specific decks, which interacts nicely with Timaeus and Wagner. And Whereas the Unseen Razor is a powerful effect similar to Lyre Song in the niche weapon decks that can enable it. Food cards in general have become less popular as other cards held together by strong synergies have become more attractive. But a wide range of food cards are still played. Most decks only run a couple of foods, but slower stall decks usually run more. Decks playing Chef Mao, along with healing synergies, can play up to 6 or 7 food cards, so have a think about what makes sense for your deck. By far the number one food which you'll find played in most decks is Lotus Flower Crisp, although it's fallen some way from its historical position as the most played card in the entire TCG. It's easier than it used to be to get around a Lotus by either dealing a small amount of damage or just ramping and passing the turn, and the impressive rate of 3 damage reduction for 1 die and 1 card isn't quite as exceptional as it used to be with all the other options you can use dice and cards for these days. However, that being said, having the option to give a critical character those extra 3 points of durability on a critical turn can easily be a deciding factor in who wins or loses the game, making Lotus Flower Crisp a powerful card most decks will want to play 1 or 2 copies of. Teyvat Fried Egg has the most unique effect of any food, being able to revive a defeated character. It has a steep but fair cost, making it somewhat niche, but is a nice card to include, especially if you're a slow deck with some team-wide healing, or a deck which can revive a character for some surprise burst damage. Tandoori Roast Chicken and Adeptus' Temptation have similar roles, providing additional reach which can let your characters hit critical breakpoints to eliminate opposing characters, even if they aren't an efficient use of cards and dice. Tandoori Roast Chicken is a more popular option because elemental skills tend to be easier to have access to than bursts, and it's a nice card to include one of in an aggressive deck which lacks other sources of reach. If your deck can easily charge your character's bursts consistently and uses them to close out the game, then it can be nice to have the extra 3 damage reach of Adeptus' Temptation compared to the 2 damage of Tandoori. There are also several food cards which are primarily used to provide healing. Out of these, Sweet Madame has actually risen to be the most popular, since it costs 0 dice while still helping you to avoid critical breakpoints and enabling synergy with cards like Veteran's Visage and Chef Mao. If you can afford to pay 1 extra die, Mondstadt Hash Browns gives you 1 extra healing, and Mushroom Pizza provides 2 extra healing but is delayed over 2 turns. If you can afford 2 dice, you can get even more powerful healing effects. Rainbow Macarons provides 4 healing, as long as you can rely on the character taking several hits without dying, so it's best used if you have one important character you really need to keep safe. Matsutake Meat Rolls provides a whopping 5 points of healing, but you'll have to wait 3 turns to get all of it, so it's best used in the slower stall deck. And Butter Crab has a similar function, shielding 6 total damage spread across all your characters on a single turn, and is best used in a heavy stall deck, which is happy to swap stall between their characters. Finally, there is a set of food cards which are strong in their niche, designed for decks which use a lot of normal attacks. Northern Smoked Chicken and Minty Meat Rolls both provide valuable dice discounts, while Drayon Grober buffs damage to hit breakpoints. All of these work with Chef Mao, making this a decent package for a normal attack focus strategy. The final choice we'll have to make for our deck is going to be our Arcane Legend card. These didn't even exist when I made my last deck building video, but as of now there are 8 different options, and they're actually all pretty good. These are event cards which will always start in your opening hand, but you can only play 1 Arcane Legend per game. 2/3 of decks in the Prince Cup ran one or other of them, so while you don't have to run any, they are very powerful cards for specific decks. The number 1 most played Arcane Legend card was Fresh Wind of Freedom. There are very few cards in the TCG which allow you to gain more actions, but this is one of them. It allows you to take an additional action after taking out one opposing character. This is especially strong in decks which can do a large amount of direct damage in a small number of actions, since that one extra action can be the one that wins the game. If you're playing an aggressive deck with high burst damage and Gambler's Earrings, this Arcane Legend card fits in nicely. Next up is Passing of Judgment, my personal favourite. This card blocks up to 3 event cards played by your opponent in one round, and can seriously limit your opponent's plays on a critical turn, blocking out food cards, quick swaps, and their own Arcane Legend cards, and allowing you to plan around their turn much more easily. It's great in mid-range decks, where you might just need to slow your opponent a little to secure a win, and also gains extra value in freeze decks, where it blocks quick swaps and tada. Ancient Courtyard is great in decks playing multiple weapons and artifacts, giving you 2 dice reduction from 1 card. In decks with enough card draw to tie everything together, this couples well with other weapon and artifact synergies to enable some extremely efficient plays. Basically, it's pretty simple, play it with artifacts and weapons. In Every House a Stove is an interesting Arcane Legend card which has received a few changes. In its current form, it has 2 uses, either to play it late game in a stall deck for up to 3 card draws for 0 cost, or to play it on round 1 to guarantee draw a talent card from your deck. It's mostly used for that second option, so if you build a deck that relies strongly around drawing certain talent cards, then this is a great Arcane Legend card to help you improve the consistency of your deck. Covenant of Rock provides 2 dice from a single card, which is a nice rate. You just need to make sure you have ways to use the dice effectively, with the condition that they are random dice, and you can only get them after you spent all your other dice. Some characters, such as Klee and Farazan, can do this easily, but it's also doable with any card that gives you dice or discounts to skills, which can be anything from Minty Meat Rolls food to weapons like the Sapwood Blade. Vicious Ancient Battle removes 1 energy from the opposing character. This is at its most useful against decks which are highly reliant on getting a burst charged early on, such as decks built around Bennett's Burst, for example. If you want to counter and improve your matchup against such decks, then this Arcane Legend is a good option. Day of Resistance does quite a straightforward job of reducing the damage taken by a specific character during a single turn. It can prevent up to 4 damage in one turn, which is an amazing rate. But in reality, it's hard for most decks to get this full value. It's best used in certain combo decks, where you may need to heavily protect a specific character from damage during a specific round, either so a support can charge their burst safely, or so an anchor can survive long enough to sweep the enemy team. Finally, Joyous Celebration is used to remove auras from your active characters to prevent your opponents from triggering elemental reactions. This is particularly valuable against freeze decks to prevent your characters from getting frozen, so you can consider this Arcane Legend if that is something you're worried about. Just be careful of the fact you can trigger freeze and overload on your own characters with this card, so watch out. Finally, there is the option to play no Arcane Legend cards at all. Even though Arcane Legend cards are strong, they are not usually cards you want in your opening hands, but instead are cards you'd want to draw later. However, you are probably playing several ramp cards and other cards that get value over time, which you do really want to play on round 1. Since Arcane Legends always appear in your opening hand, playing 0 Arcane Legend cards significantly improves the chance of drawing the ramp you want in your opener. Of course, there's nothing stopping you from putting 2 or more Arcane Legend cards in your deck, but you'll only be able to play one of them. So even though different Arcane Legends are good in different matchups, I don't recommend this unless you really know what you're doing. So, there you go. Now you should have a decent idea on how to piece a good deck together. There are so many cards in the game now, and with almost no proper guides to deck building, I can only imagine how mysterious it all appears to new players. Hopefully, this video acts as a good jumping off point from which you can learn to refine and improve your own decks. So, thanks for watching, and good luck.